This is Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing. I'm Rachel Gordon. Here we aim to make the process of writing and publishing a bit more transparent and a bit less overwhelming. Through conversations with editors and academics at all stages, from full professors to graduate students, independent scholars, and postdocs, we share stories, lessons, and helpful habits from our writing lives. We're really delighted to get to speak with Jennifer Smyth, who is a professor of history at the University of Warwick in England. She is also a critic and the author of, most recently, Mary C. McCall Jr., The Rise and Fall of Hollywood's Most Powerful Screenwriter, and several other books, which I think will come up in our conversation. But Jennifer, I was curious, since you and I were chatting before, about the fact that you go by J.E., or many of your books are written under J.E. Smyth, if you might explain to us why you do that.
There are a couple of reasons. I think that would be immediately familiar to some of your female listeners. When I was a graduate student, I, had no clue really how to get started with my publishing career, because I had these two supervisors who were very nice men, but they were really bloody useless when it came to teaching you how to become a professional writer. And so I had to do everything by scratch myself. And I found out later that I did something I wasn't really supposed to. I had an article on John Ford's Young Mr. Lincoln, which is a film from way back in the 1930s. And I wanted to get it published in an academic journal, because that's what you're supposed to do if you want to become an academic. And I was like, well, they take so damn long. Some of them take a year to get back to you. So I was like, well, I know it's going to get rejected by somebody, because that's what happens. It's my first go. So I sent one copy off to a journal under Jennifer and another one under J.E. And it was exactly the same essay. And they were both sort of historical, cultural journals that occasionally published film. But one of them didn't take it, rejected it, and the other did. And so I stuck with what worked and stuck with my initials.
Oh, well, that is...
I don't think that name very much. It's not bad, but I get a bit of amusement sometimes when societies will write emails to me and they'll be like, "Dear sir." I think that's very funny.
It is funny because I write about the 1947 movie, you might know, Gentleman's Agreement, and that novel and film is about anti-Semitism, and the main character, played by Gregory Peck, does something similar.
Yes, I read your work. I really like it a lot. Yeah, being Jewish and being a woman. Yeah. And still, I think for women especially, yes. It does come in handy sometimes just to be J.E.
Yeah.
I've been found out.
Right. Your 2024 book about Mary McCall was so readable. It was actually my bedtime book, and I almost never read an academic book before bed. And so I'm curious how you arrived at this very readable style of writing. Did this come naturally to you? How did you learn it? Did an editor encourage it?
Well, I think, again, I really start projects all on my own, and I don't really tell people what I'm doing. Very often, people will sign a contract on something that only has a couple of chapters. Everything's done by the time I approach a publisher. I have to say that when I started off as an academic writer, I felt like there was a way that you had to write. And I tried always to be sort of jargon-free, keep the ideas relatively complex, but still make it readable. But I found that gradually, as I got older, I cared less about conforming to a particular academic style. And I just enjoyed writing the way I wanted to write. And so I think maybe by the time you hit your 30s or your 40s, it gets really freeing and you just decide to do whatever the hell you want. And Mary's life was so full. I couldn't, shoehorn everything into 4 or 5 chapters, which you normally expect with an academic book, even though I wanted it to be something that was, very much about the business and about labor history and women's history and reach all of these other academic audiences. I wanted her life, in print to be almost as exciting as it must have been for her to live, or to get it as close as I possibly could. And so there were all of these smaller chapters. It did proceed chronologically because, yes, it's a biography, and I'm still old-fashioned enough to believe that chronology makes sense if you tell your story well. But there's also a thematic element to a lot of the chapters, and I wanted to keep it as clean as possible. So it really is a labor of love. Doing books like that. I was talking with another historian saying, well, do you really have to like who you're writing about? Can't you just do something that's interesting or whatever, write about something you can't stand? And I think that the kind of work I do, where very often these are people that aren't well known, that were extremely well known in their own time by their colleagues and so forth, and by people in their era, then forgotten by historians and subsequent generations, that it is an act of love in a way to go back and to spend time with their lives and try to come to grips with what moved them, what upset them, what the major issues of the day were at a personal level and at an intellectual level. And you have to spend years of your life with these people as well too. And so it was important for me to get that story right. And very often there's this kind of inner voice that you hear about what works or what doesn't. And I read a lot of what I write aloud. So if it doesn't sound right when I'm reading it to myself or to my dogs, who are sometimes my audience when I'm at home writing, then it's just not working.
But that's interesting what you mentioned before about having much of or all of the manuscript written before you approach a publisher. I've heard a lot of academics discuss this recently. At what point should they approach an editor? And I wondered, have you arrived at that over time that it works better for you to have the whole thing done? Or because people also have talked about the stress of the deadline. Once you get the contract, then how that deadline might be a negative feeling. So why do you do it this way?
I think there are lots of different reasons. I think I was lucky as well too because I talked with a historian who was very well on in his career when I got over to Britain, and he was giving me paternal advice about how to manage my career. And he just said, when you're applying for your next, tranche of money from a funding body or whatever, just make sure it's not for the project that you're working on now; it's for the next project. And he said it's better in a way to keep it close to your vest until it comes out to editors, so that then if somebody doesn't like it and you have to have it shopped around, that you spend a small window as possible getting it out there, particularly if you don't want to work with an agent or if you don't have an agent. It's just safer for younger academics to keep research that is really interesting from being circulated too often, too frequently to too many people. So it's I think it's practical on a number of levels.
Okay, so you finish the project before it goes out.
And I do have I have an idea about who I'd like to publish it.
Yeah.
But you want to write the thing first and really feel that it's ready. I don't know how well I would function if I got a contract for something and they said, "Oh, you have to finish it in 5." I don't know where I'll be in 5 years.
Mhm.
I'd rather have that kind of certainty and the kind of commitment to the project, because then I think really, if you're doing your proposal, if the book is basically done or it's near to being done, you know what you're saying, you know how to market it yourself. Because none of us really can afford a really good publicist these days, particularly if you're an academic, an academic in Britain on a British salary. That's just
Mm.
impossible. So you have to know what it is you got in order to sell to a certain extent. And I hate, this kind of position you're put in at this point where you're in a way not as creative. You're a used car salesman trying to get your piece out there. But, you have to know what you got so that you can market it to its best advantage to all of these people.
I don't know if it's as common in the UK for academics to work with agents. Is that something I actually didn't notice if in your acknowledgments you mentioned if you do that or not, or if it's something you've been interested in?
No, I mean, I've been pretty lucky because I've come into contact with a lot of editors that I like, and I meet them and can and talk with them that way. I have thought, oh, wouldn't it be nice if I could get an agent? And I thought, well, I don't know if I'd really like that very much, because then you have to send a certain amount out to this person, and maybe you don't know them particularly well, and then they want to edit your work.
Mhm.
So I was in the just by way of example, I was reading a book. It's a very interesting book that came out quite recently by this younger writer who had an agent, and in the introduction, the forward or whatever, he said that the content of the book had changed quite a lot, and a lot of his research, his footnotes, etc., had been smoothed out or removed, and he was so grateful to his production team. And
Mhm.
I don't want content lobotomies in my book. I don't want things to be smoothed out for a trade press and basically dumbed down for a particular kind of audience. I want to write the way I want to write, and so I think probably the whole agent thing is a bit too much, giving too much outside control. And I mean, how much honestly, can some of these books, these academic books, make these days. I mean, nobody's reading. I mean, for God's sakes, nobody's buying books. I mean, and if Billie Eilish can't make any money off of her book, I'm damned if any academic is going to be able to do it. So
Mm,
I would rather work with a university press with an intelligent editor and a professional team than I would with a trade press. But that said, there are probably very many trade presses out there that have great editors. I did work with one. I mean, I loved working with Keith Goldsmith at Penguin Random House. He was wonderful.
mhm.
But he was a veteran and he'd been there for years, and he retired after he did the I Lost My Girlish Laughter book with me. And I was just like, "Oh, Keith, can't we work together again?" He's like, "No, sorry, honey. I've got other things to do."
Mm.
I retired. And it's sad because when you do come along and you meet a great editor, it's like, it's great. You just want to hang on to them forever, but they've got their lives, they've got other plans. And I think a lot of these great professionals, it's sad they are retiring, and then you have to scramble to find that perfect combination. So I think I've moved around a lot
Mhm.
with editors over the years. And I suppose I'm like Elizabeth Taylor. She was in search of the perfect husband, and I'm in search of the perfect editor. So that's how it works out.
That experience with Penguin, and just to let listeners know, this is I guess it was a 1930s novel that was reissued called I Lost My Girlish Laughter. It sounds like that was a great experience. That didn't make you want to try the trade press world a bit more, or what were you thinking?
Well, I mean, I really wanted to work with the editor I worked with again, but he retired.
Mm.
And I thought, it would be a great idea because the next project I really had in mind was Mary's biography, to perhaps get that to a trade press. But when I did talk to his boss who was there, and it turned out she was a friend of Victoria Riskin, you remember from Mary's biography. She was the president of the Screenwriters Guild late in the day, who basically during her term of office at the turn of the 21st century basically said that she was the first female president of the Screenwriters Guild, and basically had erased Mary's memory. And yeah, so that, and she was actually, if you ask screenwriters in the business, she's one of the worst presidents in memory, because she basically gave all the residual money away from film work for a certain period. It was really disastrous. She just wasn't really there for writers. So this person at the press had a friendly connection with her, and I thought, well, it's probably not going to work out. And it didn't, but she was very nice, this editor, when she wrote, and she just said, it's not going to sell. This is somebody that nobody knows, and she's not a star. She's not she's a writer. Nobody cares about writers. They want another biography of like Humphrey Bogart or another biography of John Wayne. That's the way it is. People really don't care about writers, and it'd be too much work to market it. So that's in a way why you get this bifurcation, where you get sort of interesting work that comes out from university presses that very often pushes the envelope and does new stuff and has new ideas out there. And then you get a lot of very expensively packaged pulp that you've already read maybe 10 years ago. It's the same book repackaged. So I don't think Mary wouldn't have been a good fit anyway. She was a woman. The Me Too period had passed, really, so you couldn't really piggyback on that. And anyway, she had a great time in Hollywood when she was working. Things weren't so bad for women. And that's hard for a lot of people to come to terms with, because that goes against the narrative of what Hollywood is supposed to be in its big, bad old studio days. So there were a lot of things there. And of course, she's a writer. And then she's somebody who's a moderate. She's not somebody who's really on the hard left. So I think moderates have never really been in fashion in the United States. They certainly aren't these days. And so she probably was a harder sell than she could have been. But I don't care. Where she wound up was great, because I love the editorial team that I worked with at Columbia. They were fabulous.
Mm. So I guess that was one of my questions, Mary McCall being the subject of this most recent book, which again is called Mary McCall Jr., The Rise and Fall of Hollywood's Most Powerful Screenwriter, which is the kind of title that I feel like really lets the reader know, oh, I should have heard of this person. But as you mentioned, it's, she's not a household name. Was it difficult to sell the editor on this? Did it take a while to find an editor who was interested in a name that's not so known?
Well, I think to a certain extent, it helped that I had that grant from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. So I think they've discontinued the grants. I don't know what's going on, but they used to give these rather sizable for them, I suppose, not sizable, but it was sizable for me as a historian, grants to every year to a couple of film historians. and I got one for the project on McCall. And so I think that helped a little bit because the Academy seemed to be putting their money behind it. It had some attraction, and I think also because I'd done Nobody's Girl Friday, which is kind of broader history of women in the studio system, basically showing they did all kinds of jobs. They weren't just secretaries and starlets, and they were very highly regarded by their industry, but then subsequently erased from film history by film historians. So that got out there and raised a lot of people's hackles and was a bit controversial, but it got time, it got some good reviews in sort of the major trades and newspapers in the US and more widely outside in the UK. And so I think probably that helped. They were like, oh, we can market this. But I did have to shop it to more than one press because there was this reluctance even in, I think, the academic market where people are doing fewer film books. I mean, this is a consequence of the market. This is no reflection on any of the editors who didn't want to do something about a woman. It's just the rules of the game. There are only a few university presses that actually do this kind of work anymore. And I had thought it would be fun to work with a female editor just because of the content. But I think particularly for work in film history, when it comes to women's film history in Hollywood, it can be very tendentious, and I think that and divisive. And I think that there are certain camps really within the film history that want to say that women weren't active in labor unions during the studio era. They want to say that women, may have had a few chances at careers during the 19 teens and 20s, but by the time the studio system became a going concern, they were all pushed out. They, are sort of wedded to this idea that feminism didn't exist between the first and second waves. And my book basically blasted all of that apart. And so I think there was a certain resistance to wanting to have a book that had a title, The Rise and Fall of Hollywood's, most famous screenwriter. I mean, it's just what do you do when you have something that is in a way actively contradicting and to a certain extent showing up a lot of the scholarship that had been done in the past? Because the fact is, this woman was known by everybody in the business during her lifetime. She, was a presenter at the Oscars in 1943. She was a feminist who was working with all kinds of other women in and outside the business. She was a friend of, Eleanor Roosevelt, or, she was leading a labor union for a long time. And she wasn't the only woman. There were all other sorts of women who were involved, not only in the Screenwriters Guild, but across the board in unions in Hollywood. And so she was just out there. And there are thousands of documents from newspapers and trade papers that are talking about her and her life and quoting her. So she's there, but nobody paid attention to her until basically I started writing about her. And I think the place that I had imagined she would be first was not a good fit because they didn't want her to be Hollywood's, most celebrated screenwriter. They didn't want to have these headlining women that had done so well in the system. I think there is this need on the part of a lot of people working in film studies in particular to see women as basically victims within the system across the board. Maybe there's a little difference during Mary Pickford's era, but then basically you go down the toilet and that's it. So the Harvey Weinstein era is just indicative of a wider trend within the history of Hollywood. And I think that was probably unsettling for them. But I found another press that worked out really well, where they didn't have those preconceptions and were willing to take a risk and let me do things my way.
This is really a reflection just of my own struggles with my own biography. But did you have moments of wondering, because this wasn't an unknown name, is this life story worth the attention? I mean, especially maybe when you encountered some resistance, did you wonder, does she deserve a biography or any of that?
No, not for one instant.
Okay.
That's how I've always felt about the work that I've done. Maybe it was a rescue project to rescue her from oblivion, but this was a woman who was one of the most famous women in America for, nearly 2 decades. And she, was known at the time in her own industry and in the national newspapers. And she was a player, a labor leader, a feminist, a screenwriter across the board. Somebody who was also very close with a lot of Hollywood stars. So she was part of that social scene as well too. And she was just basically stripped, edited from the history books. I think it happened to a lot of women in Mary's generation. I think definitely she's not the only one. But she was chair of the Council of Hollywood Guilds and Unions. She was running, the War Activities Committee, making all of these documentaries during the Second World War, overseeing all of that. She was head of the Writers' Mobilization. She was doing all kinds of stuff. But as head of the Guild, really, not just from 1942 to 44. She was basically running things and the president from 1940-41, because the guy who was nominally in charge was basically exhausted, and then he had to be bumped up out of his office because he ended up getting a producer's job, and you couldn't basically hold an office in the Screenwriters Guild if you were also moonlighting as a producer as well. So she was there. I just felt real. I had to say it. I was angry. And I think that anger really propelled the book, because she's not the first woman that I've encountered in Hollywood or anywhere else who's been erased by a bunch of historians who are writing after the fact. And they generally tend to be male, but there are quite a lot of them that are women as well, too. And she was just the most outside case of historical erasure I'd ever seen in a field that I had been working in for the past 20 years or so. And I was really pissed off, and I was thinking as well, too, when I was a graduate student, how come I never learned about this woman?
Mm,
But then if you're in a graduate department studying film, you never hear about screenwriters, whether they're male or female. It's always directors, directors, directors.
mhm.
So there was a lot of simmering rage that I channeled into that. And so when anybody pushed back on me and said, "Oh, we can't sell her," well, I said, "Well, that's your loss."
Mm.
And you just have to have that kind of, if maybe it is, hubris or whatever, but you have to have that kind of commitment to the person that you're writing about. And so to a certain extent, that goes back to what I was saying about love. It is an act of love to spend so much time with this person, and you have to keep your perspective and be objective and so forth. But it is a kind of deep commitment that you have to have. And if you're a feminist, it's easy. If you're looking at Mary, there was no question in my mind that you had to write her story.
It sounds like you discovered her or knew of her since grad school, and so I can't tell if you held her, sort of as a back burner project for a while, or if you felt like this would be better serve me at a later point in my career. How did you figure out when you wanted to write about her?
Well, you know how it is. I mean, when you're a graduate student, you're basically told you have to write that kind of a big, sprawling book that has all of these great ideas or whatever. So you get attention. And you can't write something niche, because then you sort of mark yourself out as just a miniaturist. You know what I'm saying? So I did think about it for a while, because when I first encountered her, I was in a room, in a very airless room with the air conditioning wasn't actually working in Southern California at this point, with Ned Comstock. And I was a graduate student, and I was reading through Warner Brothers scripts, and he was, they had the Warner archive, I think, in the 20th Century Fox archive mixed together because they were doing renovations or something. And so they were all stuffed into this little tiny room, all the boxes and so forth. It was really great to be there. I was the only one. And I was reading Dr. Socrates, which is a gangster script. And I saw that, there was a woman's name listed as the writer, and that was it. I had to find out who she was, and it was just it was a long journey. And there, of course, were other women that I wanted to look at as well too. And you can't do everything at once, but I started to do the work, and then very luckily, late in the game, I was able to meet her daughters, who were wonderful. One of them is still a very close friend of mine. So yeah, it's taken up a great chunk of my life, but Mary McCall Jr. is worth every hour.
You mentioned in your acknowledgments how Mary McCall Jr.'s daughter, Mary David Shiner, was a real help. It sounds like you had had many long conversations and exchanged a lot of emails. And I wonder if you can share with us the challenges of dealing with sort of like a child of your subject's feelings and memories about a parent. As you mentioned, we scholars want to acknowledge that gulf that can exist between fact and memory. How did you deal with that?
Well, it was lucky in a way, because, well, Mary David was wonderful. I also talked quite a lot with Sheila Benson. Both of them are writers. So they had a lot of time to reflect upon her and to think about her. And it was very useful as well too. I had two of them, one of them who was very bitter and didn't like her very much at all, and the other who loved her very dearly, but also recognized that she came along at a point in Mary's life when she could be a better mother, and so perhaps she had a happier time than Sheila had had. And so there was this kind of self-awareness. And Mary David is a television writer. She's a writer in her own right. So she's aware of when she might be looking at things with rose-colored glasses. And we talked for many times, lots of emails. So I think I was fortunate in that I wasn't just allowed one interview. I, went to her house very many times. We went out to lunch. We were always talking on the phone or, doing video calls or exchanging emails. So she's become like family. And the same really with Sheila. She was wonderful, giving me photographs and talking about things. We did an event together at the Screenwriters Guild or the Writers Guild of America West. So that was a lot of fun showing the film I think Mary was proudest of, the one she did with Dorothy Arzner, Craig's wife. So I was lucky I had the time. And so I think anybody who's thinking, oh gosh, I don't know if I want to talk to the children, I mean, that's a minefield. Don't do that. They really do have a perspective that you're not going to get from newspapers. You're certainly not going to get from colleagues, because sometimes colleagues can be even worse. They have an axe to grind. And so I'm facing this now with a project I'm doing with a bunch of actors who, a lot of their colleagues are still around, but you think, the actors are some of the most self-centered people on the planet. So if you're going to ask them about another actor, you're going to automatically get something that's really, that might not be so close to the truth and objective. But the children have lived with it. And with the things if they have in their memory banks are incredible. So as a writer, I'm not just interested in how Mary felt about, her colleagues. I want to know, what kind of feminist was she? Did she talk to Hedda Hopper? But in addition to that, what do they have in common? I mean, did they go out hat shopping? Yes, they did. What did she like to drink and smoke? What was she like when she got ready in the evening? What was it like growing up with her? Do you remember dinner parties? What was the kind of ambiance? Was she funny? Was she always cracking jokes? And there were just some incredible memories of that time that you're never going to get from anybody else. And the children will have been watching as well too, and they will have been seeing everything with fresh eyes that very often you don't get from people who have been through the Hollywood mill. And to a certain extent, if they have been asked very much about this stuff, they almost have a set piece that they deliver to people when they ask about their career. So a long time ago, I was lucky enough to talk with Janet Leigh. And I went to her house, which is fabulous. And we had a long conversation. But the reason that she'd asked to see me, she agreed to see me, was because I didn't want to talk about Alfred Hitchcock. I didn't want to talk about Orson Welles. I wanted to talk about the films that she had done earlier on in her career that nobody gave a crap about. And so she had a lot of memories and a lot of things that I could ask her that were completely fresh and candid. Whereas if you asked her about Hitchcock, she knew exactly what to say, you know? But when you can get them to say things where they don't, it's nobody's asked them before, that's where you get the truth, where you catch them in a way, in a friendly way, to get that kind of perspective. And that's what I love about interviewing people.
Yeah. That said, did the children or anyone close to Mary McCall Jr. want to okay something you had written, or did you feel you needed to show them something before it was published?
I did talk with Mary David about the abuse. I felt that was only fair because she told me. She was very forth, and it didn't come out at once, and it was very difficult for her. And she's a very gentle, kind person, and what she suffered was quite horrific. And I had, I wanted to make sure that she was happy with what I was saying, but she did not censor me.
Mhm.
And there were things that came up in conversation with Sheila that I felt these were things that really affected Sheila more than they did Mary. And so I felt that to talk about them might have been an invasion of Sheila's privacy. And so Sheila and I did talk about certain things that happened after her mother and father divorced and her mother remarried. And, she went through a lot as well too, but she never said, don't write this. So it was fine.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of these more difficult times in Mary's life, I was really interested in sort of the final chapters of Mary's life. These were not maybe the happiest times, and I appreciated the way you dealt with it. It didn't seem like you were trying to necessarily make this all seem very happy ending. To me, those chapters felt like they were difficult years in her life. And I was just curious about how you thought about how you wanted to write these final chapters, or the fact that you weren't totally doing a happy ending in all of them, or maybe you felt you were. How did you see those aging kind of decades?
Well, I know there's the rise and fall appearance of
Hmm.
the title. And so there is a sort of narrative that you think the content has to conform to. But I think that I didn't want to have the facts shaped in any way by that wider expectation from the title. And I wanted to give her life a sense of, attention in all of its various ways. So I did want to look at the personal life. I did want to look at the period after she was president of the Screenwriters Guild and had her tangle with Howard Hughes and the Blacklist because she worked in television. And I wanted to talk about, her colleagues in television and, working with Rod Serling and mentoring other writers. Because to a certain extent, it wasn't just about famous Hollywood life, it was the life of a writer. A life of a woman who always knew she wanted to be a freelance and she wanted to face that fear of having to earn her living in a very precarious job. But there was a kind of rush you get from writing. We do it because we love it. And now it's become even more precarious. So, when I was reading about her early life, when she was freelancing and writing for the New Yorker and Collier's and all these great magazines, God, she could make a living. She was a chief
Hmm.
winner. She was pulling in thousands for stories, and if you adjust it for inflation, this woman was making more than I was, just from writing a handful of stories. I mean, it was incredible, but she also had a great philosophy about writing, and she wrote about it, and that kind of energy and love she had for all writers, but for the process itself, I think was really the wider story. And so I couldn't just talk about Hollywood. I had to talk about the whole thing, about beforehand when she was young and getting started, even when she was, Mrs. Morrow's neighbor, and she was saying, this girl is so bright, she has to go to a women's college, all the way to the end when she was desperately trying to get a short story published in the Saturday Evening Post. And that was her big thing when she got the Friday Girl published. It wasn't made into a film. Nobody paid attention to it except a couple of critics, but that for her was it. And even when she was going through all this hell of being abused by her second husband and having, the trauma of the blacklist and, having everything in her house basically repossessed except her typewriter and her books, which the bailiffs didn't want because they were useless. Those stories that, to a certain extent, that Mary David remembered, she would go to the library to be alone, and turn her face to the wall. And she would go over dialogue for, you know, treatments. So she was always thinking about new pitches. So even when she was down on her luck and it wasn't so glamorous, she was still trying. She was still a writer. And so this is the story of a writer, and a writer, has a lot of downs and some ups. And I wanted to give those the respect, the downs and the ups, and all of the bits in between, the kind of respect that a life like hers or any writer's really deserves. Because God knows these days we get little respect enough as it is as writers, and things are getting much, much worse thanks to the tech bros.
Mm. Yeah, the writing really feels like hope in her story. I'm wondering though about the abuse by her second husband. Was that difficult to write about?
Yeah, I mean, it was funny. I was talking about this with somebody just the other day. I mean, because she wrote this wonderful character, stayed with her for a number of years, Maisie, that Anne Southern played. And Maisie was the kind of, she was a working class girl. She was a showgirl. She knew all about, you know, sexual harassment and how women never got an equal shot at a decent paycheck and the tenuousness of the show business world, all of that. And she knew how lousy men were. And some of Mary's best lines in these scripts were about how men just weren't worth the trouble, that they were just like car models and you just had to wait until a better one came out the next year and not get hung up with it. So in a way, it was like when she married this guy, David Bramson, she wasn't taking Maisie's advice. Someone was like, well, what would Maisie have said about Mary's decisions? But the thing about Mary is that she was really an old-fashioned equal rights amendment feminist. Women could do just what men could, and if you didn't like it, tough.
Hmm.
She was behaving just like a Hollywood mogul would, because if you think about her old boss, Harry Cohn. In the 40s, he divorced his older wife that had been around with for a number of years and married Joan, who was much younger, very pretty, great hostess, a friend of Mary's as well too. But he dumped the older woman and picked up a new model, and she was just like, "Well, what the hell? I'll do what as well too." Because I think at that point in her life, she was like, "I am the most powerful woman in Hollywood. Everybody has to listen to me, including these producers, because for years writers have never, had any power in Hollywood. And finally, when she was president, she got them their contract. She got them pay raises during the Second World War. You know, they had a moment, and
Mhm.
I think she felt that power, and she was just like, well, I'm going to do exactly what I want to do, which is what a woman should be able to do.
Yeah.
So they then, she couldn't have what she wanted, but now I don't think we really can have all the things we want now either. I mean, and to a certain extent, I look back at her life in the 30s and 40s, and I think actually the Hollywood business was more advanced than it is, to a certain extent now. And there were more films about women at the time, but that's also an economic argument because the Hollywood producers knew that more women went to the movies, that they controlled the ticket sales. So there was this catering to women that I don't think we see now. But then nobody cares about film anymore. Film is dead. I
Mm.
mean, it's been replaced by TikTok and video games, and it's on its way out. So when film mattered, though, she had it. But Bramson was a very hot guy. He was a very attractive man. I've seen the pictures. And so I can't really blame her because I mean, we've all done stupid things in our lives. I've done plenty of them, but unfortunately she married a mistake, and
Mhm.
that's expensive. And I think because she wasn't a practicing Catholic, but I think maybe she might have felt bad about getting divorced a second time. And then she had
Mhm.
married David. And, I can't really be all that sad that, you know, Mary McCall married David Bramson because she had Mary David. And so there's always a silver lining. And Mary David is one of my absolutely favorite people. And she raised two writers, you know, even when she was suffering this. And, to a certain extent, she was getting smacked around by David Bramson, but she also hit back. This is the thing. So she didn't take it lying down.
Mhm.
And there were some tremendous fights in that house. So she tried to make it work. But, nobody's personal life is perfect. And to a certain extent, maybe that's what made me like her.
Mhm.
Maybe, well, it's what will make readers like her a little bit more because she wasn't perfect, you know?
Yeah. One of the things we discussed a lot on this podcast is about publicity, what academics can expect from presses in terms of publicizing our books, and kind of the changing landscape of what academics ourselves do to publicize a book. This recent book of yours I thought got really nice attention, and now that you've had several books out, I'm curious with your perspective, what do you think has helped with getting more attention or publicity?
Well, when I was younger, I have to say, I was really lucky with my first press because I had a great editor. Her name is Leila Salisbury, and she had a great publicity team. John Hussey ran it. And the book was sent out to all of these places. So even as a relatively young person doing my first book that was basically my dissertation, I lucked out. I got it seen in the American Historical Review and all of these other places. It was one of those choice books. They're always doing these things. And, it got some attention when it could have just, basically disappeared. But I think it's in a way it's luck. I lucked out, even though it wasn't like, I don't know, it wasn't Hatchet Press or anything. It was the University Press of Kentucky, but they still put it out there. And it's in all these libraries. I'm still staggered. These days, if I look at gradually, there's libraries are closing. So there are fewer and fewer copies of my books that are in libraries, even though supposedly, the books have sold more copies. And it's just because people aren't buying, people aren't reading. The publishing business is in deep shit. But it really depends where you go, you know? And if you're an academic, I mean, there's certain advice that I can give to younger people. Don't turn up your nose at British presses if you want to publish a chapter, or even if you want to publish a book in Britain, because you get to keep your copyright, and you end up making more money in the long run than you would necessarily in the United States, where you really have to work hard to hang on to certain bits of your copyright or your rights. And so I would say, in terms of publicity, if you know certain editors yourself, and you do have to get out there, you do have to contact them. Sometimes you'll have a good publicist, and if you have a good plan when you're doing your initial marketing plan with the press after you've signed, you really do have to dig up all of the book prizes that are out there and remind them of the rules and when you have to submit. You have to have a list of the editors where you'd ideally like to see the book, but sometimes even if they send the book out, the person who's running the outlet won't run with it. It is to a certain extent a crapshoot. I have been lucky with where some of my books have been placed, and I liked getting a TLS review for this last one. That was great, and but I think also getting a review in some labor journals as well too. Jacobin was fabulous, but you really have to work for it. I hate it because it embarrasses me having to be like a used car salesman. Oh, please, but you do have to do it. And to a certain extent, and talking with some of my friends who have agents or whatever, they sit on their ass and they don't really do that much. So save yourself the money, unless you have a really great agent who loves what you do and you have a good rapport. Very often, if you get that agent for the one book, they'll do all right for the first project, but then they'll just basically sit it out for whatever you do next. So this is a sad circumstance for one of my colleagues who just did a fabulous book and is just having all kinds of trouble. So I think you do have to get out there and graft a little bit. You do have to keep on top of things. But if you have a good relationship with your press, they really do try to put things out there. I'm sort of interested. How did you arrive at wanting to have me on your podcast? Yes, maybe it was the press actually that talked to you about it. You never know these sorts of things. You get offers or whatever, and you really have to take the time. But it depends as well too. So many people have teaching and really punishing schedules, and they're doing all of these other things. Do they have the time to do it? But for me, I'm fortunate because I love my subject. I do anything for Mary.
Mm.
This, of course, is a pleasure talking with you.
I think it might have been, was there a Wall Street Journal mention or review of this book?
Yeah.
Okay, so you think that just came about through
No, no,
press?
no,
No,
no.
okay.
I'll tell you very honestly, I don't know Scott Eyman, who did the review. Of
Mhm.
course, I was very glad to get it, but I believe that was my publicist.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, at the press. So she pitched it to him. So
Huh,
yeah,
that's great.
they have some great people. And when you find these great people in your career, you have to thank them and be grateful and just hang on to them because it really is, it does a lot, I think. The Wall Street Journal, I was then like, when I found out, I was like, oh great. And Mary would be like choking if she knew that she was getting a review in the Wall Street
Right.
Journal. Do you know what kind of politics these people have? And then basically, the publicist is like, calm down. This is going to do good things. Well, who am I to say? So, I was delighted. It's hard because you write the book and then you feel enormously sort of empty and kind of deflated when it's over. And then you have to gear up and start doing the publicity. And if you're writing on another project, it's hard to actually think that the publicity is important when you've moved on. And you just have to, keep on top of things. And it can be rough to like make yourself do things. Because I'm basically a very lazy person. I would love to just take a break after I've been writing and not do all this other stuff, but you know how it is.
Yeah, for sure. There's two questions that we ask all guests, and one of them is if there's something you wish you had known earlier in your career about writing or publishing.
Yeah, I mean, I thought about this. I love the questions that you have. I mean, these are really great questions. I mean, and it's hard to look back in hindsight. I could say, oh, I wish that I had this supervisor that could have connected me with Knopf or somewhere where I could really get a decent book deal for my first book and teach me what I'm supposed to do. That didn't happen. I found everything on my own, which was great. But then when I did, and I went to this smaller press, I met a wonderful team and a fabulous editor that I had a great relationship with. And they really took the time with me to respect what I wrote. And it wasn't all, changed around and regurgitated. I think really it's good to let your career develop. And to a certain extent, you will have mistakes. You will have things that you will feel will go wrong. You will regret things bitterly and you will wish, oh, if only. But it is a learning process. And I think the most important bit of advice I ever had from another writer, it was Alvin Sargent's. And he said, it doesn't matter if anybody even ever sees it apart from you and your ideal writer in your mind or whoever it is. It's the writing and it's the process that is the most important thing. And you have to focus on that. And he was told me this before AI and before everything in the world seemed to be set on fire for the creative industries. But it really does matter. And I have noticed that I love creating the work and doing the research more than I do about I love it when people read it, and they like it. And when you said you enjoyed the book, I was so, so grateful, so thrilled I feel, oh, that's great. I'm vindicated. But in a way, it's the process that you love. And if you love writing on your own without AI and just that feeling of discovery, that's the best feeling. And you have to take the hard knocks with the good stuff, That's part of it. And it's great.
Mm, absolutely. Another question that we ask is if there's a writing practice or habit that is working for you.
I have a desk, right? But I haven't been able to use this desk for months because my son is doing his A levels. And so I don't have a desk. So I would say don't get hung up with having to have a space of your own, even a room of your own. You can write on the floor. You can write on the sofa. You can write standing up in your kitchen while you're waiting for the dinner to cook, whatever it is. And you can be doing your writing. You don't have to have all this fancy stuff. And I agree with Ernest Hemingway. It's great if you can go somewhere where it's quiet and write every day. But as well, too, as long as you spend some time thinking about writing and give yourself time to let everything sort of regenerate for the next time that you can do it, you can keep up the momentum. Yeah. But you don't need a desk. You don't need it. You can just do it on the floor. Because I write a lot sitting on the floor. As long as I have my laptop and I have access to a few newspaper archives, I'm fine.
Yeah, no, I agree. Even I sometimes find that actually a change of location is sort of helpful for me to have a changed perspective on my own work.
Yeah, and walking. I think
Mm,
Lillian Hellman was right. You have to, if there's a problem, you walk it out, and
mhm,
you get away from everybody. And I do need quiet. That's the thing. It's hard for me to do it in coffee shops. I don't know.
mm,
People have incredible concentration that can do that, but I need to have some form of quiet. And actually, standing up is a good way to write.
mm.
Found that. Maybe it's because I'm getting older. When I'm sitting down or whatever, I want to go to sleep.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer. This has been really fun. I so appreciate it.
I'm delighted to meet you at last because I love your work. And thank you so much for having me on the podcast. It's been so much fun.
Our pleasure. Thanks for listening to Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing, sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. Visit our podcast description to find out how to contact us and send us your questions about academic writing and publishing. Follow us on social media at Writing It Pod and subscribe to us so you never miss an episode.